Hey everybody, Chapter 12, the investigation of computer-related crime. This is going to be more of a methods block. Again, it's one of those chapters that will blend into your computer deliverable, or the computer crime deliverable, as far as how we approach investigations and how we go through the investigation. At the end, you should be able to explain, understand the search warrant application process, for electronic evidence, identify hardware and storage devices, explain and understand legal standards, best current practices, explain and describe the best current practices for collection, distinguish between single scene, multiple scene, network crimes, and then communicate an understanding of the network architectures. So I hop right in here. Uh, the investigator roles. All right. You have first responders. These are going to be the folks that are dispatched to maybe another crime scene, and they end up with technology, a cell phone, something like that. You have your investigators. These are going to be your general detectives. These could be the person that picks up the case after the first responder goes there, and you turn your case basically over to that investigator. The forensic analyst. This is going to be a subject matter expert. So there might be a blood, DNA. You may have some specific person that's going to be doing the forensic analysis. And then you have private police and corporate security. Private police and corporate security technically do not have the cover of law. We call it the cover of law because they're not sworn police officers, but they perform a function either under a contract or under some negotiated agreement with law enforcement. Sometimes not. A lot of times corporate security does their own thing. Private police on a lot of occasions will do their own investigations. And typically you'll find private police are people brought in from the law enforcement world. And then your subject matter experts. These are going to be people that are qualified to testify, qualified to give expert opinion. I was qualified as a Department of Justice expert witness. So that makes me a subject matter expert in that thing that they qualified me for. The worst thing you could ever do as an investigator is say, I'm a computer crime or a computer expert, because you're never going to be a computer expert, because you're not going to know things from the 1950s to today about every one of the OSs, every one of the stuff. And when you say I'm a computer expert, you open yourself up. So a good prosecutor is going to keep you very fine-tuned into what it is that you're testifying on. For example, I was qualified as a DOS file metadata expert. Very specific for the crime that they were looking at. All right, so let's dig in a little bit to these different groups. So our first responder, this is your patrol officer. This is the person that is going to be going to the scene and then finds something that's going to involve a forensic team. You may have a body. You may walk into a narcotics investigation. You go there for domestic, but then you end up with a narcotics case. So there's a bunch of different ways you can end up with electronic evidence. You may not be, our first responder typically is not going to be someone with a search and seizure, okay? So they're not going to go there with a warrant. This is, again, somebody that kind of goes into the opportunity crime. For example, I went on a domestic, and when I walked in, there was a brick of hash sitting on the coffee table. Well, the domestic turned into a drug case, still had to work the domestic, but then we also had to change it over to a narcotics investigation, which came from the initial call of a domestic. A lot of times first responders are going to be looking at the damages done to people, property. They're going to be putting perimeters out. They're going to be controlling folks. And that's really what the first responder is there for, is to make sure that the scene is contained, that there's no contamination. If you have a body on a scene, 9 times out of 10, if the paramedics show up, they're going to contaminate the scene by walking through the blood spatter and other objects on the crime scene. So we want to make sure that we control that as much as possible. There will be times you just can't avoid it. You may have someone that may be still alive, and the paramedics work real hard to keep him alive, but he passes. Well, then you've got all the contamination of all their work, their footprints, all the stuff that they did to him, CPR, the chest compressions, that's going to break some bones on some people. So you got all that other stuff that goes into that first responders kind of problem set. So that first responder is going to try very hard to make sure they keep everything as tight as possible. And then right after that, once they've got everything contained, they're going to make a decision. They're going to call back to the department, and the department's going to send out a detective maybe. Or they'll wait for everything to come back in, then the detective will take over once it comes back in. Normally, if it's a significant crime, murder, or child exploitation, things such as that, the scene will be sealed and the detectives will go out to the scene itself. The investigators are going to organize the investigation, kind of like what you're doing with your computer crime deliverable. You're doing witness interviews, you're collecting evidence, you're putting things into a form that you're then going to show as a final result at the end of the course. You're going to document your investigations, even in electronic investigations. In fact, more importantly, in electronic crime investigations, you want to document everything that's on that scene. You want to document what you did to that computer. You want to document who touched the keyboard. You want to make sure that you don't have patrolmen flipping through the phone doing their own investigations, typically being nosy, because cops are nosy people. I got to be real honest with you. You give us an opportunity, we're going to flip through things kind of to see what's in there. So the investigator is going to control all that with the help of the first responder, but they're going to make sure that investigation is set correctly. The right people are doing the right collection. The CSI team is being brought in. That's the right team for the right collection. Sometimes the investigators may or may not have a computer experience. We've done a lot of training with detectives around the country, and you'll walk into a department and the guy will be a computer crime investigator, for example. And you start talking to him, and very quickly you realize that this was a promotion. So the person's in that job because they got promoted into that job, not because of their expertise, but because they have certain quotas they have to meet for union representation. So I was a patrolman. Now I'm going to be a detective sergeant, but I have to be a detective sergeant somewhere. And if the computer crime section is open, well, then I get that position. Sometimes it's based on your knowledge. Sometimes it's not. It's all depends on the department you work for. All depends on where it is you are in the world. I mean, small departments out in the Midwest or in the middle of the country, they do not have experts for every type of crime. They have generalists, and the general crime investigator takes everything from the murder to the arson to computer crime investigations and child pornography, exploitation, all that stuff fits under his hat. And he's kind of the expert of none. He does a lot of stuff, but he's just not an expert in many things. He may have one good specialty, but that's about it. So your digital analysts, these are going to be your technical experts. If your department's big enough, you're going to have someone that is detailed to do that work. They're going to go to training. They're going to get their certifications. They're going to get all of the things that they need to have so that they can be a good investigator. The forensic analyst, they're going to provide a lot of efficiency because they know what to look for. Instead of looking at the entire computer, they're going to go to certain part or components of the computer because they know the lion's share of the information you're looking for resides in those containers. You're going to find that the digital analyst is, especially in the computers, tends to be younger. A lot of interns fill jobs for digital analysts. They come in, they take an interning position, they work some cases, they do kind of the drudge work of imaging hard drives and writing down the numbers. And then you have your more seasoned guy that's been there for a long period of time that will actually do the actual analysis. I've also found through my traveling and talking to people in different departments that once people get kind of stuck in that role, they like to stay in that role. They don't like to leave being a computer analyst and going back and working the street. There are some departments that force people out, which is a bad, really a bad decision, because a digital analyst may be really good at what he does as a digital analyst. He may not be that great as a cop. There are a lot of civilian analysts when you start looking at your government agencies, OSI, CID, FBI, all those, Homeland Security. You're going to have more civilian analysts. You're going to have more civilian folks working for those prime investigators that are working the case. Kind of like if you ever watch CSI, you got Abby, you got Donoso and Gibbs. They run around and have all the fun, and then they bring everything back to Abby, who then kind of goes through and works through the case. Again, very loose association on that. I've never met anybody that had so many skill sets. It was an expert in everything. So Abby is a makeup of probably 15 or 20 different analysts that you would normally find. Corporate security investigators, these are people who are hired by corporations. You're probably going to end up being in corporate security, depending on how your company or organization works their security. Private computer security, lots of former cops are in that space. They go get their training, they get their expertise, they kind of build their reputation in the law enforcement world, and then Kroll or SAIC or Raytheon will come along and say, hey, we'll pay you 5 times what you're making at the department, and we want you to come work for us. And you'll see an attrition rate, a heavy attrition rate of people after they've gotten to a certain level of certification. And that's why law enforcement a lot of times is hesitant in sending officers to a lot of training, because they know the more trained that person becomes, the greater likelihood is they're going to leave that department and go work for private or corporate security. The thing about private and corporate security, though, is they don't have the letter of law behind them. They work very much on their own. You're working within your own company. You have no jurisdiction outside of the walls of that company, and you have very limited jurisdiction on the inside. You can't arrest. You might detain until law enforcement shows up. There's a lot of things that you can't do as a private citizen. And corporate security and private security are private citizens, just enabled by the company to keep the peace at the company, basically. So your technical expertise guy, your SME, that person's constantly going to training. Every year you're redoing your certifications. Every year you're updating your CV. You're making sure that you're staying relevant in all the specialized tools that are coming out. In a year, you might have 6 or 7 different phones generations come out. You may have Android come out several different times during that time. You may have a couple of iPhones that are deployed during that time. So you've got different operating systems you're having to work for. You now have to go to new training to make sure you can work on that type of system. So it's a constant battle of keeping your knowledge, your technical expertise up to speed. And people that don't go to training, they don't keep up their expertise, very quickly are left behind. And you'll find that they're that disgruntled analyst that says no one ever sends them anything, or they got fired and they don't know why they got fired. Well, it's because they didn't keep current with what they were doing. A lot of analysts, though, have a real dilemma, and this is something as a manager you got to make sure that doesn't happen, is analysts get tied to doing the work and they forget to do the training. So you got to make sure they go out and get their training. Even if they know something, they still have to have the training. They have to have that certification from somebody saying, yes, you've been trained, yes, you know what you're doing. Because when you go to court, you're going to be challenged on your certifications. You're going to be challenged on your knowledge as a subject matter expert. And then just one last thing, as I was closing that last slide, just remember the one thing I told you: never, ever, ever let a prosecutor qualify you as an expert of all, because you'll never be an expert of all. You might think you are, but I promise you, you're not. And somebody will come in, and the first question out of their mouth will be, so can you tell me about the operating system of a Rayovac 550 computer circa 1959? And you're going to go, what is that got to do with anything? It's got to do with your credibility, because you said you are a subject matter expert of everything. You better know everything. Okay, so be very careful on that. Don't ever let a prosecutor put you in a bind like that. Most won't, so you should be okay. Single location electronic crime scene search and seizure. This is something that someone has to be competent doing. You have to know how to isolate the computer, get the Wi-Fi, the Bluetooth, get all of the connectivity removed from that computer. So you're looking at that standalone box, and you're making sure that standalone box is not sending anything else out and receiving anything else in. We call that the inculpatory and exculpatory. Making sure that there's no more inculpatory information coming onto that computer and no exculpatory information is being put on that computer. So you're protecting and keeping that computer in a pristine manner. Because when I look at your log files, I'm going to see when you seized that computer. And if there's changes to that file system after you've seized it on that scene, well, then we have an issue, because you are responsible for any changes to that computer once that computer has been seized by you. Now, we're not talking about operating system issues. That's going to happen. So as soon as you seize a computer, it's going to change. We all know that. But data, user data, doesn't change unless somebody does something to cause user data change. Word files, Excel files, things such as that. Deleting files, things such as that. So don't let yourself get into that bind where you lose evidence because you were not protecting that standalone machine and keeping that standalone machine clean. All right. When you're doing the single scene location, again, this is the boundaries are within that address, that physical address that you're at. So if I'm at 123 Main Street, then that's what I have authority to go to. It doesn't matter if that person stores all their stuff on Dropbox. If they do, that's outside the scope of your investigative power at that moment. Your jurisdiction ends at your county, state, or your local or police municipality borders. You don't have the right to go to other places without permission. The court in your local jurisdiction can't give you jurisdiction in another jurisdiction. You have to work with the other jurisdiction. So if I did find something on the network, I would send a subpoena off to that jurisdiction, have it entered in as a foreign document, and have them help me. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. So search warrants and electronic evidence. When you go to the court, imagine an apartment building. And I kind of like to give you an analogy of this, so it's kind of in your mind when you're looking at these four things. So you're looking at an apartment building, and someone comes to you and says, my bike was stolen. I have a crime. So number one, my crime has been committed. I know a bike has been stolen. I say, well, what happened? Well, I was standing on the sidewalk. My bike got taken out of my hand, and I watched the offender run into that apartment building right there, which is made up of 50 apartments. Okay. I now have evidence of the crime exists. I have a video that's on a pole, and sure enough, we see that a crime existed. We see the bike taken out of the individual's hand. We have evidence that this crime has been committed. We have a crime. It's existed. Okay. Now is there a place to search? Absolutely. So now we have this apartment building. here's the problem. Because it's an apartment building and there's 50 apartments, those are 50 isolated domiciles within that structure. I don't have authority. So if I go to the judge right now and say, hey, Your Honor, I got a bike that was stolen. We're going to investigate this. We need to go into this apartment building to find this bike. And I would like you to give me a search warrant for all 50 apartments because I know it's in there somewhere. The judge is going to laugh at you. Why? Because you're asking him to basically compromise the constitutional protections of 50 families looking for a single person, which you don't know exactly where they went. And they're not going to do that. You have to have much more detail in your request for your search. So I need to know where. So let's change the scenario and let's say it's just a single house. And it's a single home dwelling and the guy grabs the bike, runs through the front door, and there has not left through the back door. We know that the bike person is in that house. Well, now I can go to the judge and I can say, hey, at 123 Main Street, there's going to be a bike that we're looking for. And I need to go in and search for that bike. And the judge is going to say, sure, I will give you permission to go in and search for that bike. Now I go in there and I'm searching for the bike and I see a motorcycle. I say, oh, well, what's this motorcycle doing here? So I start looking at the motorcycle and then I run the plate on the motorcycle and I start doing a bunch of other stuff. I'm now exceeding my authority because I'm there to look for a bicycle. A motorcycle is a completely different type of object. Or let's say I go into that house and I say, I want to look for a bicycle, and I open up a very small container, and inside the container is narcotics. Well, because a bicycle could not fit in that container, I've now exceeded the authority of my search warrant, and I'll lose that evidence in court because I can't look in for something somewhere where it could not possibly exist. Okay, and this goes back to times when they had long rifles and people would search through small drawers and they would find things and use that against people in court. And they said, no, that doesn't make any sense. You can't find a shotgun in a small desk drawer. You're going to find a shotgun in a closet and other places that make sense, but that doesn't make sense. So there are a lot of restrictions that come into searching. So when you see these kind of cop shows where they go in and they tear apart everything and they're looking for everything, yeah, sometimes that's okay and sometimes that's not. Depends on the size of the evidence, the type of evidence, and the reason you're looking for that evidence. Okay. So if I'm looking for a thumb drive could be in a very small location. So I need to make sure that the judge knows I'm looking for thumb drives and I'm looking for hard drives and I'm looking for, so I have to be expansive in my list of things that I'm looking for. I can't just say I'm looking for all things computer, because now I've included everything like the TV and I've included everything because everything in a house basically has some type of circuitry in it. The investigator has to make a decision on whether or not the computer itself is the target of the warrant. Okay. There's a lot of times when you go into a scene and you say, yeah, I want to go after this computer, that computer may be completely useless to you. You may be looking for a computer that's connected to a network that's going to give you some information from the network. So we have to make sure that we don't just say we're looking at this computer. We have to be able to articulate that there are other places that I can look on for this type of information. For example, network drives, things such as that. Now, here's the unique thing about remote storage. And once you leave the computer, one of the issues you're going to run into is, well, where can I look? Well, if you look in somewhere that doesn't belong to the client or belong to the victim or the suspect, but belongs to another company, you got to get another warrant. So let me give you just three clear examples. Let's say I want to get all the messaging that's on an iPhone. Well, I have my warrant for the system in my hand. So anything that's on that system is mine. I can image that device and I can take anything off. But I also have to get a warrant for Twitter, I have to get a warrant for Facebook. I have to get a warrant for Snapchat. I have to get a warrant for anything that is not owned by the person or any one of the entities that I'm already going for a warrant on. So if Facebook owns Snapchat, well, then I have a clear nexus, and I can say, well, they own, so I can request data from Snapchat under this warrant. If not, I have to get a warrant for AOL, or excuse me, Facebook, a warrant for Snapchat, a warrant for Twitter, and they all have to be separate warrants. So if you start thinking about it, on a modern phone, I may have 100 or more apps that I'm using for different things. I could have 100 search warrants and 100 appearances before a judge to say, I really need to get into this information. Okay? So what we got to be very careful of is exceeding our scope. And the biggest thing here is it's all about exceeding your scope. I've also got to be very careful that I don't go and execute searches somewhere that I don't have authority to be. For example, back in the day, you would look at Hotmail, and you would see the link on the Hotmail, and you would click on the Hotmail, and up would pop an email message. Well, if that message had not been read prior to clicking on that link, what would happen is the computer would reach out to San Jose, California, and it would take the mail off of the Hotmail server, bring it back to wherever I was doing my investigation, Missouri, for example, and display it in Missouri. So what I did is I just executed a search in San Jose, California without jurisdiction or a warrant, and brought data back to my computer that I'm investigating. Okay, so I conducted the search illegally. So there's a lot of little things that go into play when you start talking about what you can and what you can't search, especially on network and network systems. External storage. It all depends on how the storage is connected. If the storage can be clearly associated to the person and to the object, well, then I can, without any doubt, use my warrant to go in and look at or take those mediums saying that they could have been used in the commission of the crime. Where I run into an issue is if I have a shared environment where I have 3 or 4 people that use a common workspace, and there's a thumb drive there, and the individual says, oh wait, that's my thumb drive. Well, the burden of proof now becomes yours to prove that that's not his. It's not his to prove that it's his. It's yours to prove it's not his. And that gets kind of forgotten sometimes. And you get law enforcement that get very much into kind of the role, and they forget, the intricacies sometimes of collection. And you'll find that they'll violate, not intentionally, but accidentally, and then end up with fruits of the poisonous tree, where you can't use any of the evidence that's gathered. And search warrants, old search warrants, way back in the day, it used to be these blanket search warrants and covered everything. We have to be much more meticulous in our search warrants now. The courts are smarter. Defense attorneys are smarter. I'll give you one case. Individual was on the sex offender list. He's standing outside of a school, taking pictures of the schoolyard with his phone. The police approach him, recognize him as being an offender, and ask him, what he's doing. He was in violation, so they took him in for violation, and then they got a search warrant for his phone. And in the search warrant, they said they wanted to search for everything. What was the crime? Well, the crime was he was taking pictures of little kids. That's what they were trying to prove. So what they went into his SMS messages, and they started going through, and they found these communications, and they tried to use that in court. And the defense attorney said, well, wait a minute. We all know that an SMS message cannot hold a picture. That's an MMS message. An SMS message is a text-based message. So why is law enforcement looking in a text container for a picture? Oh, coming back to the old hiding a shotgun in the desk drawer thing. So the court upheld and said, yeah, you're absolutely right. You can't put a picture into that text messaging system, so law enforcement had no business being in that text messaging, and they lost that evidence. So sometimes it can be kind of frustrating, just the intricacies of how the network and computers work. And that's why you have to have specialists and you have to have analysts that do this kind of work, so you don't end up losing evidence. The biggest thing on handheld devices, one, you can carry them anywhere. These are our phones. These are our things that we carry with them. The biggest mistake made by law enforcement is association. You have to build the biology to technology bridge between that device and that person. Just because the person is carrying the device does not mean that that device belongs in that location or to that person. Association by ownership or holding onto it doesn't always work. That phone may have been given or asked, or a person may have been asked to hold that phone. So when you arrested that person, you have another person's phone, and that other person now has the right to say, well, wait a minute, that's my phone. It's under my account. It's not accessible by this suspect. Therefore, you can't use what's on that phone against that suspect because you had no right to go into that phone in the first place. They're absolutely correct. If the person has no access or ability to access that device, then it's going to be very hard for you to say that they could have committed a crime with that piece of equipment if they can't use it. Okay? When we are getting devices, especially these handheld devices, things such as this, we're also looking for the things that they connect up to. So everybody knows you connect up to Wi-Fi. When you go into a building, your phone connects up to Wi-Fi. So now the router is a part of a possible crime. So I do have a nexus to say, hey, I want the router. So on my search warrant, I'm going to get a physical location, and my link to that physical location might be the router or a modem or an Ethernet cable that was plugged into that device. If I can show that that device was tied to that specific location, well, then I can get the medium that they use to communicate with outside, or the devices, because they may have relevant log files, etc., that will show use by that device. And that's all usable in court. When you're doing a search warrant, you're basically going to tell the court, this is my plan. This is what I plan on doing. And we may have a nighttime environment, so we're going to have the SWAT team. We may have some basic information for the judge to consider. The judge may say, let me throw an example to you. So I may say, we're going to take down the pastor of this church, and we're going to wait until he's on the podium in front of everybody, and we're going to take him down. The judge may have a problem with that. The judge may say, wasn't there a better place and a better time we could do this? And you may be asked by the court to not execute that warrant at that time. So they may come in and say, or they may give you some conditions. You also may have the company come back on a warrant that says, well, we have intellectual property, and when you take this computer, you're really going to be exposing our intellectual property. We don't want you guys looking at our intellectual property. We don't want you knowing the secret sauce here at McDonald's. So the judge at that time can say, okay, well, then we'll assign a special master, and a special master is brought in, and that special master looks at the information first, and if there's nothing of any conflict, anything like that, he'll tell the defense attorney and the investigator, this document's clearly usable, and now you get to look at that document. Now we're talking about a time-consuming investigation. You're going to spend a lot more time on that investigation than you ever thought. So special masters, they're used to protect data and protect the intellectual property of corporations. And when you have a special master, you really are going to be working for a very long time on this case. When you're doing your search warrant, again, this is not a Cop 101 class, but there are some things you want to take into consideration. Things you should know. as somebody that's going to be in the field. So when police come into your company or corporation, you'll understand what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing. Okay. So the investigators are going to, safety, 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 safety. That's the number one thing. We watch TV way too much to see how things go badly when safety is not taken into consideration. So we have to make sure everybody is safe. The police are safe, the suspect is safe, and the citizenry is safe. We have to protect the citizenry more than anybody else. The suspect is the next, and law enforcement is last, but we still are going to protect those law enforcement guys. Typically, you're going to remove the suspect, remove the witnesses, and then you're going to go through the bystanders to see if any of the bystanders are a part of your crime or part of your case. You'd be very surprised how many people set fires and then come back to watch the building burn. So interviewing people in the crowd is a part of a criminal procedure or a process of first responder, I guess, more. But in a search warrant event, you may end up having to talk to some of the suspects, witnesses, or excuse me, bystanders, because they're a part of the company. So I go into the company and I arrest the system administrator. Well, I may want to talk to the people that immediately show up because they're people that are available and around, and they probably have access to those devices. So we may ask some questions like, do you have access to any of these computers or servers? My suspect pool may grow by interviewing bystanders in the area that's being searched. I'm going to get everybody out of the way. No one needs to be in my scene. No one needs to be there YouTubing what I'm doing. So we're going to clear the scene. The scene's going to be cleared. You're going to get rid of your suspect. The witness is going to go. Everybody's going to the interview room. They're going to wait until I'm done doing my search. It's not going to be one of these things where everybody's standing there watching me. Unless the defense attorney or the lawyer says, nope, we're going to be here. You don't have to have the person standing there, especially if they're a adversarial person. It's always better to get rid of the person from the area if they're going to be adversarial during the collection of any items or evidence. Biggest thing about computers, if it's off, leave it off. That's just a card. That's a golden cardinal rule. Do not turn something on if it's off. Give it to your expert. Let the expert figure out how they're going to extract the data. You can leave computers running until your analyst shows up. Or if you're the analyst, you're going to go in and you're going to do an assessment of that device to make sure nothing destructive is happening to it. And then you're either going to pull the cord from the back of the computer because you don't want to pull it from the wall, as you may have a battery backup that keeps it going. Or you're going to document and you're going to image the drive while it's running. You're going to try and get the RAM memory. You're going to try and get information off the system while it's in its actual running state. Mobile devices, leaving a device on means that data within phone calls can change due to receive new phone calls. This is why we have Faraday bags. This is why we isolate the device. We turn off Bluetooth. You turn off the phone. You put it into airplane mode to protect the device from receiving new phone calls, getting more messages, getting other stuff. So we don't want other people changing data that's on our device or on our phone. When you're going through the crime scene, safety first, biologics. You'll see people walk up and grab things and sniffing them and doing all that stuff. You got to remember, this is a crime scene. It could be a meth lab. You're sniffing around and poking on powders that could be corrosive, could be very harmful to your body. I had in 1981, I had a lieutenant that was missing his lip right in this area right here, and he was a New York police officer, and he had gone up to a white substance and done the Kojak thing. He dabbed his finger in it and wiped it on his thing to see if it was cocaine. Turned out to be battery acid. And the type of acid it was, it just ate away his lip. And he would tell you, you know, the last thing you ever want to do is do the things you see on TV, because the things they do on TV are probably going to get you hurt. Don't ever change the evidence. Don't try it. If you make a mistake, document it. If you step on a bullet casing, if you step in a puddle of blood, if you do something dumb, write it down, because if you don't, it's going to come up somewhere along the line. Someone's going to look at a photograph and say, wait a minute, what's that other footprint doing there? Or they're going to look at something and say, well, wait a minute, why is that changed? I walked into a lab. We were imaging CDs in a big tower, and the individual had headphones on, didn't hear me come in, and when he turned around, he had a CD in his hand. And he saw me, he went, oh, and I have that effect on a lot of people, I guess. But he dropped it, and I reached out and I grabbed that CD with my bare hands. Now I put my fingerprints, on the CD. So guess what? Now I'm doing all of the fingerprints so that they could throw those into the case, so they could exclude me. I'm writing a statement on why I touched the CD without gloves. It's just a big rigmarole. But if I hadn't, the evidence that was on that CD would have been linked to me because my fingerprints were on the CD. So you got to document. You got to tell people what you did wrong. Photograph the scene. You're going to document. Notes with diagrams, checklists are going to be done, and you're going to follow a checklist. If you are an investigator in any department, you're going to have a checklist, and you're going to follow that checklist. It's going to tell you what type of search you're going to do. You're going to do a grid search. Are you going to do a sweep search, circle search? What type of search are you going to do? What type of bags are you going to use for different things? There's going to be a checklist to help you out. You're going to pack things correctly. You're going to take appropriate storage care. I remember we took a refrigerator that was a part of a crime, and we had to protect the insulin was in because the suspect was diabetic. So we had to protect the insulin that was in the door of the refrigerator. So we had to go and get a cooler, put ice in it, put the insulin in the ice. And then someone said, well, how are we going to get this refrigerator in our sedan? So then we went to a U-Haul. We rented a U-Haul, drove the U-Haul back, and we took the refrigerator with us as part of our evidence. So you may run into those unexpected little life diversions, as they say. Multiple scene computer crimes are very complicated, very complex, because you're probably going to be multiple jurisdictions. And if you're outside the United States, now you're dealing with the State Department, you're dealing with Interpol, Europol, one of the many other law enforcement agencies around the world. You may have evidence on this computer, or you may not. You may have a pointer to a file that's located in a jurisdiction that doesn't have the same laws that we have. So guess what? You don't get the evidence because their laws, no crime was committed in your country or our country. A law was broken. So they may not prosecute that person for the same thing. They may not have a mutual aid agreement between us. We may not have any written agreements between us for the transfer of suspects and people and goods, or not goods, but evidence. So you've got to make sure that you are prepared for a multi-jurisdictional case. You may have multiple different operating systems. So you may be the greatest person on Windows, but how are you on Linux, Mac, Unix, other operating systems that are out there that you may run into, and you may have issues with. In today's world, a multiple scene is probably what you're going to run into. Finding a computer that's standalone, that's never been on the internet, just it's getting harder and harder to find those. We find more and more that people that are committing crime using the internet. So you're going to have a multi-scene or at least a network-based crime. So you need to know the difference, and you need to know the borders of where the local area network or the LAN and where the wide area network or the WAN begin. Companies have ownership of the LAN. That's their switches, routers, cabling. Once you leave the company's border, now you're in a different world. Now you really don't have any authority to do anything. And investigators, may, or law enforcement even, once that leaves the United States, may run into the issue of not having any access. You may have a couple of companies that work together. So you and Company X and Company Y may have a mutual interest to work together. And you may investigate together. But who owns the infrastructure between the two companies? Unless it's a LAN where you guys are connected directly, you're now going across open network territory, or the WAN. So you may, in your investigation, unwittingly commit a crime of intruding on someone else's property to investigate a crime that was committed on your network. Be very careful. Inside the walls of your corporation, you can investigate up to a certain point. If you run into child pornography, you have no authority to investigate that. You normally can investigate fraud and other things like that, but people that are saying that they're going to hurt people, mass shootings, things like that, you don't have the opportunity to say, yeah, I'm going to investigate this on my own. It's not your purview. Again, child pornography, not your purview. But things that are not damaging or harmful to others, fraud, network intrusion, things such as that, you're probably going to have a lot greater latitude to investigate through your company. The internet, it's a WAN that is inside, or it's basically your local access network. The internet is not the internet. You're still going to be using TCP/IP. You're still going to be communicating across the normal protocol, but you may not have the authority to investigate the internet once it leaves your border. You may be on an internet. You might be on Cox cable, for example, or Spectrum cable, and you're all on a Class C network. You can investigate the nodes within your control, but you don't have access to work on the other potentially 252 devices that could be on that Class C network that you're investigating. So you got to be very careful that you are legally able to investigate this intranet. Okay, make sure you have very clear guidance from your company on what they want. The internet, it's a network of networks. Nobody owns the internet. It's hubs, switches, routers, all mixed together that allow packets to transfer from one place to another, as we all know. So when you are going out on an investigation, you may cross many different territories or many different companies to get to a certain point. The first thing that I always did when I sat down with a investigator, or excuse me, with a victim, is I would ask them, how do you send email? And they would tell me, well, I connect up, I do this, because what that does, it tells me what their steps are and where the boundaries are on their network. If it's a web-based device, I know that. If it's a local server, I now know that. So it gives me different ideas of ways to approach the investigation. So I always map out, how does an email go from this computer out to the world? And that usually gets me through all the routers and hubs and switches and through the firewall. One of the first things that an investigator is going to do when they get a case, so when I was at the Sheriff's Department, I would get a case. As soon as I got a case, I'd send a preservation letter to whatever ISP I was working with. So if it was Cable America or Yahoo or one of those other ISPs or larger venues, I would send them a preservation letter saying, this is what I'm looking to do. This is the account we're looking at. Do not allow this account to be deleted or changed. Now, what that's going to do, it's going to block the account. So immediately the suspect's going to know that you are looking at them. This is a preservation letter, but will protect your network. There are times, though, when you want to hold a preservation letter. So my initial approach was, I'm going to issue a preservation letter, but then I might say, well, you know what? If I do that and lock the account, they're going to know I'm coming. I may wait on issuing that preservation letter until I'm a little bit more clear on which network I'm going after, which person, suspect, and witnesses, etc. Because I don't want to show my cards before I have a really clear idea of who it is I'm going after. If you walk in and give me a case and I know exactly who I'm going for, what ISP, what person, etc., preservation letter is going out. If I'm not really clear yet, then I'm going to hold off until I have cleared up who's involved, what ISPs are involved, etc., what accounts are involved before I send out those preservation letters. All networks work across the OSI. It's a standard model, open system interface, standard model in the world. And you can use that understanding of the OSI model when you are figuring out how did something happen, okay? It says here the abstraction of human users at layer 8 and policies governing them at layer 9. These are all things that provide guidance, okay? These are policies. They're not strict rules that are going to prevent me from doing something. You may have policies in your firewall. Doesn't mean you're going to stop me from doing what I want to do if I work hard enough to get around your firewall. But if you understand how the OSI model works, you're going to understand how things are able to occur on a network, because everything has to go through the OSI model to be transmitted from one point to another point. So one of the things I'd really encourage you to do is go onto YouTube and look up OSI, the Open Systems Interface, and just learn about the layers of the OSI model and understand what the application layer is, what the network layer is. Understand how those layers all work together so that when you send a piece of information from one computer to another computer, how it transits through those layers on one side, transits through those layers on the other side to go from application to application. All right. Local system administrators, they're going to be your best source of information about a network. There are various security systems commonly used by business, having logging features that may help detect anomalies. It may be up to the investigator to quickly notify competent authorities to preserve the evidence. Here's where you got to be careful, and this is something that every investigator will tell you. Just because they're the system administrator doesn't mean they're not innocent. They're innocent. The system administrator could be the person that you're looking at. So be careful before you go in and say, hey, I need your help, because that person may say, yep, got it, and then start getting rid of all the evidence because they know you're coming. Okay? Have a trusted network administrator on your side. Find someone in your community, find someone at your company that you can trust, vet them, background search them, make sure that they have no issues, and then use that person in your investigations. Okay? Have them go with you. So if your administrator does turn out to be someone that you can't trust, well, then you have that kind of administration expert with you that can help you out, understand what's going on the network. Places that you're going to go when you start talking about the network, we're looking at MAC addresses, and this especially in routers and switches. MAC addresses, IP addresses are going to be key for who might have been on the network, especially if they're using a dynamic host control protocol or DHCP and they don't have assigned IP addresses. So the person may log on and get an IP address. That's going to be tracked at the router. That's also going to be tracked at the DHCP server, which hopefully will be local. So we'll have some information about the individual. DNS, the domain naming service, is going to give us a lot of information, and then point-to-point protocol is also going to give us some good information. But those log files are going to be very important to us. When you're writing your report, especially when you're writing your reports for this course, we write in third person. we got to present the information from a non-biased perspective. Okay, so you're going to always use the third person, and you're going to be that person overviewing the whole thing. You're involved, other people are involved, but you're going to be that person that sits above looking down on all of this, and you're going to write what you're seeing. Your report very likely will be a piece of evidence that is going to be key in whether or not we can get a plea bargain from this person. In other words, we're going to go to this person and say, look, we don't want to make this an extracted or an entangled trial. You don't want that because then we have to charge you more, get a longer sentence. Let's plea out. Take 5 years. We'll knock it down to this crime, and you get to go home or get to go to jail for 5 years and be done. This is something that is done quite often, and it's all based on your report. The better the report, the more information you give the prosecutor, the more ammunition they have to work with that suspect, to get that suspect to plea. And most prosecutors want the person to plea. Pleading is not a bad thing. Plea is frustrating for the investigator because you want the max every time. But the plea deal has to abide by certain rules. Certain things have to be, and to be very honest, the prosecutor may look at your case and say it's kind of weak. We're probably not going to get the conviction we're looking for here. We need to plead this guy out so that we can at least get something on this this guy to go down for something. If we're not going to be able to get him to go down for what we'd really like to take him down for. You look back over time, plea deals have been, they're pretty much a routine thing now. We didn't take down Capone because he was killing people. We took down Capone because he was a tax evader. So, the prosecutor is going to need that understanding of what your case is about. And again, don't fall in love with your case. I think I said this in another slide set. Don't fall in love with your case. Your case is going to be subject to the ability of the prosecutor to present the case. And you may have a weak prosecutor too, which is very frustrating. All right, so the hearsay rule prohibits statements made by outside or present proceeding while it is offered as evidence of the truth of matters asserted therein. Okay. So basically what this is saying is if I go into court and I say, I did hear, that's hearsay. Or Betty told me, that's hearsay. John told me, that's hearsay. Those are things that no one can actually prove. I have to say what I understood. Okay, I understood that in this conversation, this is what's going on. You can't say what this person said because that person's not testifying. And there are exceptions to this. Notes on the witness stand. You can use notes from your investigation. So you may get up there and say, well, on June 10th, I went onto this scene and I found a body and blah, blah, blah. Those are fine. Notes on the witness stand. Investigative notes can be used on the stand. Business records. So I do a call detail record, which is considered business records. I can get the call detail records for a phone system, which tells me when phone calls were made, when phone calls, how long a phone call was, and the number that was called. Those kinds of records I can get as part of business records. The business records are not hearsay. They are collected by a system, so therefore they're presented. And then also presenting the best evidence. There may be times where a person makes a final blurting statement before they pass away. That's going to be included. You're going to be able to make that statement, or that person can make that statement, and that can be used. Someone may be talking to another person in a patrol car, for example. This is very classic, where two suspects are in the back of a patrol car and they're both talking to each other, and the police officer records their conversation or witnesses their conversation, and that can be presented as best evidence. There are a lot of challenges out there to the forensic analysis. It's been called fraud science. It's been called all kinds of different names. Bottom line is there is scientific value and scientific methods that allow us to produce evidence. You may hear a term where someone says, you've been daubered. And what happens there is you get an expert witness up on the stand, and an expert witness is found to have lied, or their credibility and reliability have been exposed. For example, you may get someone up there that is testifying about a drug case, and they've been to this school and this school and this school, and the defense gets up and says, we called those schools and you never attended them. Well, I took YouTube, and I did attend those courses, but I just never went to the actual school. So it's kind of like I went to the school. You're daubered. You're done. Your testimony is out. You're no longer an expert witness. And then once you're daubered, you will never, ever, ever, ever testify in a criminal prosecution again. Because daubering is kind of like the #1 sin out there. That's a great way of getting rid of an expert forever. Chain of custody. Oh, gosh, we teach class after class after class on this. And people still violate it. Chain of custody is a legal document that records the history of the evidence from the time it's picked up till the time it's disposed of by the police department after the final appeal. Chain of custody is something that gets people in trouble all the time. Digital chain of custody can be complex. It can be hard. Thumb drives, hard drives, things like that, they can be challenging because you can change the data if it's not protected correctly. If it's not collected correctly. So if I pull the cord on a computer and there's a notepad document that's on the system that hasn't been saved yet, I may lose that document if I haven't done a RAM dump or some other means of collecting that note document. Chain of custody provides me clear responsibility for ownership of the evidence once we collected it. And once it goes into the chain of custody, it never comes out until either the court or someone else decides it needs to be disposed of. In the time limits have worn out, the last appeal is done, they'll get rid of items and chain of custody is closed out. People make their mistakes is someone will pick it up and hand it to someone else, and then that person is the first person on chain of custody. That's going to get you in trouble in court. The person that picks it up is the first person on that chain of custody. It's just the way it is. And chain of custody is extremely important when you are working with digital evidence, because it's your word that everything was collected correctly. It's going to be your word, and that can be backed up by this chain of custody document saying that you did have possession of that thumb drive, you did have possession of that hard drive. It didn't just show up in court, magically. You actually documented and collected that piece of evidence correctly. All right, and chain of custody really helps prove that. Okay, it's not going to it's not going to give you cover on something that's corrupted, but it's going to definitely tell a story about that piece of evidence and how that evidence could have gotten corrupted during the chain of custody or during the handling of that evidence. So again, chain of custody, super important. And again, they can be very complex. We spend 2 days actually going through chain of custody, detailing chain of custody, practicing chain of custody, It's that important that they do a 2-day block in law enforcement on collecting and chain of custody. All right, so this has been a very strategic overview of the collection methods. A little bit about our procedures in law enforcement, some corporate information. A lot of this will apply to your work you're doing for your computer crime deliverable. Read the book. Make sure that you dig into some of those sidebars and those snippets, and you'll find them very interesting. So with that, I will say goodbye, and I will see you in the next session.